Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. And welcome to our first IIASA Public Webinar of 2022. This is our fourth event in a series that brings the fantastic work IIASA has to offer to a public audience. IIASA conducts policy-oriented research into problems that are too large or too complex to be solved by a single country or academic discipline. So our researchers are using applied systems thinking to tackle the challenges facing our society, such as biodiversity, risk and resilience, or water management, just to name a few. They partner with other scientists, government, and local entities to create a broad understanding of the problems that concern us all. They deliver important scientific information that is then used at different levels of government to make decisions on the future of our society. We believe that this information should be available to all, and we're also interested in new perspectives, which is why we've launched this series. It's a conversation with IIASA experts, which begins with a presentation and is then opened up to a question and answer. Today, we're joined by Leena Srivastava, the Deputy Director General for Science at IIASA. Leena provides interdisciplinary scientific leadership to the Institute to ensure that IIASA research stays at the forefront of scientific endeavor. Before IIASA, Leena was the Vice Chancellor of the Terry School of Advanced Studies in New Delhi, India, an interdisciplinary higher education institution focused on sustainable development. She has over 3 decades of experience in research in the areas of energy, environment, and climate change policies. Leena will talk to us today about setting research agendas that are relevant and impactful. She would like to encourage you to share your experiences and your questions and thoughts on how we can do things better. So please do type your comments, questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So we're going to start the presentation, and I'd like to pass the floor to Leena. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ian and colleagues, for having me as part of your public webinar series. I have chosen to talk today on a topic which is dear to my heart, of course, but also extremely complex. I, of course, cannot claim to be an expert on this subject, but I do have some experiences to build upon, and that would be my aim for today. Before I get started on the main substance of the topic, I did want to share some thoughts on this evolving, rapidly changing world that we are talking about, which I've labeled here to be a paradoxical world. My reason for doing so is something that I'm sure you're fully aware of. It's we have a rapidly escalating scale of global sustainability challenges that we are facing, but at the same time, we are under tremendous time pressure to respond to these challenges. And this time pressure is being felt both by science and by the policymakers or decision makers in the world. Science has been preparing for a long time with these challenges and raising awareness on the challenges, but the complexity of the challenges keeps increasing and the time pressure also at the same time. And the challenges that we talk about, some of them have been referred to by Ian, but a more complete list or more comprehensive list is provided here. But again, this is not exhaustive. There are challenges that we face on all 3 pillars of sustainable development: the economic, the social, as well as the environmental. The science that we are talking about today is much more sophisticated and much more powerful than ever in terms of the computational abilities that we have. And yet we find that we are struggling to inform decisions and to win trust of governments as well as society at large. We know that we need more integrated systemic research with a high impact and a high level of societal relevance. But the capabilities for undertaking this research are not evenly spread across the world. We know that when science is undertaken in the context in which it has to be applied, it builds trust at a much higher level than otherwise. But the capabilities, as I said, are not evenly distributed, and even the access to science is very patchy, to say the least. We are living in a world which is facing increasing risks and disruptions. And it's something that science has been warning about for a long time, and yet we find ourselves increasingly unprepared for the compound and colliding risks that we are seeing. And I think COVID-19 in the last 2-3 years, I don't know if we can call it COVID-19 anymore, but COVID-19 has held this mirror up to all of us that we do not have the kind of science, the data, the understanding of the interlinkages, the response mechanisms in place for us to be able to deal with this. But we are also living in a world of rapid technological development. And these technologies not only pose challenges, but also offer a number of opportunities for us. And again, COVID threw up the opportunities provided by information technology, by artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on, which allowed us to respond in a much more agile manner than in earlier instances. So we need to find a way of ensuring that the technological developments that we are witnessing are available to society at large in a much better manner and without the divides that we saw in the past. We know that we need to focus on removing inequities. We need to focus on justice and issues of fairness. But we are also witnessing a concentration of wealth and power that seems to be continuing unabated. There are calls for open science, but financial resources are shifting from public to private hands at a macro level, with its implications for research funding that is available. And at the same time, competition for research leadership is intense. So we talk about collaboration and the need for collaboration, and we are trying to live up to that as well by ensuring that we bring in a lot of interdisciplinarity as well as transdisciplinarity into our research. But at the same time, we struggle to get our voices heard. So the growing number of research institutions which are there in the world have to be celebrated, but it is also resulting in a fragmentation of research resources, not just financial, but from an expertise perspective as well. And this struggle continues. Recognizing the systemic nature of the problems that we are facing, as well as the solutions that we have to put in place, funding agencies as well are putting in place or calling for research proposals and projects in the form of grant challenges. Several efforts have been made. This figure that I have in front of you is just an illustration from one such effort, where a set of people have tried to identify from their perspective what they believe are the grand challenges. And depending on the audience that you speak to, you may come up with a different list. However, the exercise itself is extremely useful, and it helps us to focus on those challenges that we think are crucial to tackling the societal needs, such as climate change and biodiversity and food security and so on. These are some of the pros. The cons are not really cons if we are able to ensure that in this effort of bringing in research from academic institutions and from research institutions to focus on these grand challenges if we know that the grand challenges, while they are focusing on innovation, are not the only silver bullet in this effort to find solutions. But we also have to be able to address wider issues such as consumption choices, such as the regulatory measures that can be put in place and so on. And we also have to recognize that science communication has to be strengthened much better. It is not enough for us to undertake the research that we are trying to put in place and then leave it at that and not take it the next step to influence policy and to influence decision making. We know that there are calls for systemic approaches. This is visible in many a place. The Agenda 2030 document enjoins us to look at the SDGs as integrated, indivisible, and balancing the 3 pillars of sustainable development. The Paris agenda also talks about climate change and sustainable development more or less in the same breath, and emphasize the fact that these go hand in hand. Increasingly, in recent times, we have been emphasizing that we cannot look at either climate mitigation or adaptation or resilience building, but have to look at all the 3 together because of the situation that we are in. We recognize the strong linkages between climate change and biodiversity and human health and every other SDG as well. And we also recognize that every hazard risk that we are facing today is in one way or another linked to all of these above issues and the 3 pillars of sustainable development that we are not actually adhering to. And we recognize that there are these feedback loops because we are not stopping climate change despite all our mitigation efforts. And therefore, these feedback loops have to be factored into decision making as well. So essentially a very, very complex world that we are living in that we have to deal with. Again, as in the case of the grand challenges illustration that I showed you, this illustration is talking about the interlinkages amongst the various SDGs and the 3 pillars of sustainable development. But I did want to emphasize, keeping this as a backdrop, the fact that in the same way as climate and biodiversity are considered to be core for maintaining Earth systems, from a social systems perspective, science and governance provide the same kind of foundational core and that we need to emphasize upon. So that takes me into what we have been attempting to do in IIASA. Sorry, I was trying to see if I can move my picture from here. It may be blocking your view, but I hope you can live with that. So let me come to IIASA for a minute. IIASA is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. It has a mandate to support research in relation to problems of modern societies arising from scientific and technological development. So as you can see, it's an extremely broad mandate. We have been trying to deal with this mandate by coming up with 10-year research strategies. And the last or the newest 10-year research strategy that we put up was in 2021, just the year that has ended. And that is where this whole question came to mind and the challenge came to the fore. The theme that we chose for our new 10-year research strategy was to reduce footprints and to enhance resilience. And that we thought captured the essence of what it is that we need to do in the coming 10 years. Our vision is to be the primary destination for integrated system solutions and policy insights to current, emerging, and novel global sustainability challenges and threats. And as you can see from this vision statement, that we will have to deal with many issues that we may not even be aware exist today. So how do we organize ourselves to be able to respond with the kinds of robustness and agility which the times require us to respond to? The objectives that we have set for ourselves is to enhance and excel in systemic research, to have a high relevance and impact and to be at the cutting edge of methods and applications. A very tall order that we hope to be able to live up to, and hope to be able to live up to in an agile manner. And we have tried to organize ourselves into programs and research groups to give us that ability to respond to an evolving situation. So organizational structure was one of the first things that we did take a look at. And what you see as a picture on the left is trying to encapsulate this 10-year strategy. We do focus on the 3 pillars of sustainable development, and in the center have tried to illustrate the SDGs that we will be capturing, with a core emphasis on issues of governance and, of course, equity and justice, which is also highlighted over there. Going forward from research strategy to its implementation, there are various drivers of research in IIASA that we have identified. The value proposition of IIASA that we are trying to build upon is the fact that we are a systems analysis research institute, focusing on developing models, tools, and methods to demystify global sustainability challenges. I've very deliberately used the word demystify because of this complexity of interactions that we are talking about. If you are involved in the modeling community, this might seem to be very simple, but if you are part of the larger society or even in the decision-making sphere, then being able to comprehend these interlinked, interconnected challenges that we are facing and relationships that we are trying to encapsulate is not such an easy task. So through these models and tools, we are trying to help decision makers crystal gaze into the future and see how they can make more informed and scenario-driven choices. Most of our work is at a global and international level, but we are increasingly focusing also at national and subnational levels as well, because that is what, again, the times require us to do. The other key driver, which I'm sure many of you would resonate with, is the fact that financial resources are going to be key for us to be able to undertake this kind of research. But we are faced with an environment in which free resources are dwindling. And resources are increasingly project-based, which reduces the freedom of researchers to set their own research agendas by trying to visualize the challenges that are going to come up in the future. But having said that, we are definitely keeping a clear focus on societal relevance of the research that we do in IIASA, and are trying to reflect this in everything that we do, right from setting our own research agendas to evaluating our performance as well. As far as the research environment is concerned, we again, despite the fact that financial resources remain a challenge, are trying to keep pace with advances in scientific computing, with advances in the information technology sphere that I spoke about earlier, with advances in methods such as citizen science, earth observation, etc., and trying to ensure that in dealing with the complex challenges that we are facing, we are as efficient as is possible and as effective as is possible. So with that context setting, the needs of a dynamic research agenda that we have today are to stay ahead of the curve, as I mentioned a little while ago, by anticipating the nature of research needs and being able to respond to it, which means that the research that we undertake, some of it will have an immediate application value, but some of it is research that would have to be of high risk nature, which will have to be exploratory, and which to some extent reflects our own thinking of the challenges that we will face in the near and medium term future. We have to be equipped with adaptable, state-of-the-art research models and tools that can be deployed as and when the needs arise. So that emphasis here has to be on adaptability. We have to be able to show a dexterity to respond to emergent needs. That means that we need to have the reserves of finances, of skills, and of the infrastructure that would allow us to respond to these emergent needs while undertaking the research that we are already committed to. So again, a pretty tall order, but we have to organize ourselves to be able to do this. So as you can see from the bullets in the top three boxes here, finance, organizational design, and capabilities are going to be key for us to be able to establish that research agenda and implement it in a responsive manner. So our endeavor in IIASA has been and will continue to be to strengthen our ambidexterity at all levels. Ambidexterity is a term that I've borrowed from management science. And what I'm referring to over here, is our ability to be able to both engage in exploratory science as well as be able to build on the strengths that IIASA has already established. This came up from a lot of researchers within IIASA as we were drawing up our 10-year strategy. And we have now tried to reflect it at all levels within IIASA. So structurally, we do have one of our programs that has a larger emphasis on developing new tools and methods and exploring these opportunities. Although at the same time, we are encouraging all the other programs as well to engage in at least a percentage of the research in this kind of exploratory ventures that would allow us to be better prepared for the future. And at the same time, trying to see how we can encourage individuals within IIASA as well to exhibit this kind of ambidexterity, to be able to balance the needs of the present with the needs of the future, the needs of the research that we are comfortable with, that we are strong in, that we can build upon with research that would require us to stretch beyond our comfort zones. To remain current with these rapidly evolving scenarios, structurally, we have, as I said earlier, programs and now research groups that we have put in place. And we have given ourselves the luxury, if I can call it that, of being able to evaluate the research focus that we have reflected in these research groups at the end of every 4-year time periods, and then to be able to see whether we need to redirect some of our research or adopt new research groups so that we remain true to our 10-year research strategy, but at the same time respond with greater agility to the evolving scenarios that we have. We also are increasing our abilities to enhance participatory approaches. This was already something that was extremely well done in IIASA, if I may say so myself, in the research projects that we have been undertaking. But now increasingly, we are also trying to see how we can enhance participation in the research agenda setting process in IIASA. We have a new program that we have put in place called the Strategic Initiatives Program, where in particular, we are reaching out to all the member countries in IIASA and the national member organizations to see how our research can be influenced by the priorities that they might want to see reflected in our research agenda. So that's just one example. There are many more. We're also trying to see how we can strengthen access to IIASA science by adopting a more open science approach and by enhancing our science communication efforts, and are also trying to see how we can adopt more novel approaches in doing so as well. So from everything that you've heard from me thus far, I hope that you're able to appreciate the very fine balancing act that we are trying to put in place. We do have to be able to also, going forward, enhance our strategic private sector partnerships, not just for the reasons that increasing financial resources are concentrated in the private sector, but I think we're also seeing an increasing level of awareness in the private sector, role change that they are playing in issues of governance, the technological capabilities and applications that we can learn from as well. And I think we have to have the humility to be able to say that. And the fact that there is a great degree of influence that the private sector has that we can also leverage to be able to influence the global agendas and public goods. We are actively encouraging gender and geographical diversity in our staff and in our partners. And this is something that we hope to continue to strengthen as we are going forward. We are also going to try to see how we can diversify our funding resources, in particular to be able to give us that freedom to do more exploratory research than we are currently being able to do. We're also going to focus a little bit more on our impact evaluation in a more strategic sense, and to be able to better balance scientific excellence with a broader stakeholder relevance. Beyond the global scale, going down to the national and local levels as well, that I mentioned as being critically important, also to be able to build trust, and for research organizations in general to be able to counter a little bit a lot of the fake news that we are today having to deal with. So with that, I would like to thank you for the time that you have taken to listen to me and to the experiences that we are going through in IIASA. And I would love to hear from you on what you may have done and how you would look at agenda setting in this very complex environment that we are in. Thank you. Back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Leena, very much for a very insightful and interesting presentation. Please, everybody, please add your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the page. We're particularly interested to hear your experiences about setting agendas, research agendas, about what's worked well for you, what's not worked well for you, and also any insights or questions you may have for us. But just to get us started, before the questions come in, I've known you for quite a few years now, Leena, here at IIASA, and before you came to IIASA at TERI. And I'm curious about what brought you into the world of research or research management, if you like, and what you sort of enjoy most about it.
Well, that's going back several decades now for me, Ian. What brought me into research was pure coincidence. I should just mention that. I was, well, looking for a job here in India and wanted to be relevant to my skill sets. And the organization TERI was just being established and was looking for researchers. And so that was coincidence, I guess. But the subjects that we were dealing with early on was, of course, the energy challenge. We know that oil prices, we went through two huge spikes in the 70s and 80s. And actually in the 70s, early 70s and late 70s. And the energy crisis was huge, even in a country like India, and issues of independence, etc., were huge, security. And then, of course, the climate change agenda had also started heating up at the same time. The interlinkages between energy and climate change, the need for modeling. In India, we developed one of the very first energy economy models. So it was just very exciting to be able to do new research and at the same time to be able to contribute to the policy making processes in the country and to see the response and the impact that one was able to have. So I think it's just this entire chain of things, the value creation that we were doing as researchers that got us all excited. And over a period of time, of course, the interlinkages is something that we built upon and gathered knowledge about, that added to the excitement. Research management, research administration was part of the evolution. I guess as my hair started going gray, I got more of an opportunity to move into these areas. And yes, I think that brings its own excitement to be able to move from doing research yourself to be motivating research, guiding research, but continuing on the learning process forever.
Thanks, Leena. And you've told us a lot about guiding the research and helping to set an ambitious research agenda. I guess one of the questions is, do you think the research system outside that IIASA has to tap into in terms of sort of, you know, the funding and the research environment outside is aligned and with the priorities and challenges that you've sort of explained in your talk for IIASA?
I think the research environment is a broad word. I think the funding environment is increasingly aligned to the fact that we need to take more systemic approaches, that there has to be societal relevance, that we have to involve all stakeholders in our research and have to be agile. So I think that alignment is increasingly taking place. Again, it is uneven. But I think the bigger challenge is in the science systems itself, in the incentives that we are offering to researchers, in the recognition that we are providing to researchers to be able to balance scientific excellence with societal relevance. And therefore, that environment, that part of the research environment still tends to skew research more towards high quality publications, which is very good, which needs to be done, but the balance is a little skewed.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. Well, that leads me onto a very nice question from Holger. And so he asks if you could tell us more on what you mean by increasing societal relevance and also balancing that with stakeholder relevance.
So again, going back to the world that we are living in, interconnected, integrated, even from a stakeholder's perspective, I think we do realize the very strong relationships between policy choices and societal preferences, which is reflected through the ballot box, if one can call it that, between policy and industry and so on. So all the stakeholders necessarily have to be part of the solution, and they have to be able to take care of the perceptions and the influence of other stakeholders on their own choices. But from a societal relevance point of view, again, I mean, this interdependency of the multiple stakeholders and the realization of the power that each of the stakeholders has on the other requires that the policy choices, the even corporate choices or the industrial choices that we make do have to respond to what wider society needs. And societal relevance can be brought about largely by, as we mentioned earlier, by ensuring that we are able to involve these stakeholders, not just in the research process, but in the research agenda setting process. The dilemma over here is that all of this takes up a lot more time, increases the complexity of the processes that we put in place, and increases our call on financial resources in particular. So I think research organizations have to see how they can become much more efficient in the process of bringing in external perspectives and responding in terms of our research. So if we are able to find a way by which we are able to telescope, in a sense, the research that we are undertaking to inform us of the more research challenges that we will take up in the next stage from a societal relevance point of view, and just keep it consciously in our minds such that we improve both our effectiveness and efficiency, we may be able to deal with it better. But I do not have a one-size-fits-all solution for it. It depends on the kinds of research that is being undertaken, the opportunities that we have for interacting with our stakeholders, and of course, access. I think that is also a key issue.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, there's a few questions around this in the chat. I mean, Virginia asks us about how, you know, it's, and you've touched on some of it already, how to ensure that research results are applied. And sort of, I don't know if you've got sort of examples or tips from your experience of things that have worked particularly well in the application side of research.
It's not easy to get research results applied unless we ensure that right from the design stage of research, we are inclusive. Two examples that I will try to give very quickly, not easy to give it quickly, but I'll try. We did a very extensive energy economy model for India, and we came up with some very nice scenarios of how to mitigate climate change and do so with a very strong techno-economic argument for being able to do so, and made a presentation at a fairly high level in the country as well, and proved the economics of specific interventions even outside of the integrated modeling sphere to be able to illustrate how every intervention could be sustainable in itself. But in that particular exercise, we did not take into account the challenges of governance, the challenges of capacities and capabilities of the context in which these solutions would have to be applied, and of course, the implications of a highly unequal society. And so there was a great degree of interest in the research, but we were unable to translate it into something that would reflect in policy and in implementation. The other example that I wanted to give was with decentralized distributed generation options. When we talk about energy and mitigating emissions from energy, decentralized distributed renewable energy generation options is a key. And we came up with we learned from our mistakes, we came up with what we thought was a fail-proof solution, and the government even took on board a lot of the suggestions that we came up with. But again, when we went to implement that particular challenge, it turned out that capabilities did not exist at a grassroots level. So we required developers to stay with a project for 5 years, build capacity, and transfer the management of those assets to local communities. And we very quickly realized that while there were a number of developers who were interested in implementing the projects, none of them was really interested in staying with the project for 5 years, because that was not part of their core business. It was not part of where they wanted to spend their money, even though there were financial resources and subsidies that were provided by the government to ensure that the activity was financially viable. So when it is not your core business and you're imposing it because you want a particular outcome, the solution just failed. And for 5 full years, we got no result from this particular activity. There are 2 or 3 other very good examples, but I will not go into it. But, you know, as researchers sitting and doing our research in the first instance on models, we were not able to visualize certain things. We learned from that process, took it back into our analysis, but then came up with some other problem. If in the process of that research, we had multi-stakeholders around the table, and there again, I am fully cognizant of the fact that we can build in biases when we have this multi-stakeholder community. So again, I do not want to present it as a very simple solution. It has its own set of challenges. But the more we are able to address this, the more inclusive our research is, the more we learn from others' experiences. I think that issue of making mistakes, of being agile, is something that we may be more effective in being able to address. And that's the only thing I would say over here.
Yeah, so these are real challenges, Leena, that you're explaining. Maybe we can jump to a slightly different area, because there's quite a few questions regarding this. This is around open science and open access to research. So, one thing it can do is increase equality in research, is open science. And Leila asks us if there are strategies at IIASA about moving more. I know IIASA already does quite a bit of open science, but about moving more towards more open science.
Yes, a set of colleagues in IIASA have recently just submitted a very detailed policy note as well as guidelines on everything that researchers within IIASA should do, not just to place our science and models and tools in the open access, but to ensure that the underlying infrastructure that we are using for developing these models and tools is also of a nature that can be easily accessed by communities, research communities across the world, and others that might want to use it. So there's no point for us, for example, to put our models in the open access if we were to base it on commercial software that may be out of reach of people, or use such highly sophisticated software that may leave a few people behind. And that's one of the balancing acts that IIASA has to perform, that while we would like to be at the cutting edge, we would not like to be so far ahead that we leave the rest of, that's a very arrogant thing to say, please take it in the right spirit, that we leave a large part of the world behind. So we have to be able to balance that and see how we structure our research such that it provides the solutions, but is also, again, inclusive in this sense.
Thanks, Leena. One of the other questions or one of the other sort of thoughts was around listening to your presentation. Everything was around this idea of sort of competition versus sort of collaboration. So, in the research system, is the competition for funds, or it's better to collaborate for funds? And again, with all of it, it comes through again. This sort of can you sort of comment and give your thoughts on this sort of the differences and yeah, the dilemmas that are faced with this?
Once again, a very complex question, Ian. The reason why we would collaborate, why we need to collaborate, why we must collaborate, is because of the complexity of the science that we have to be engaged in to deal with the global sustainability challenges that we have in front of us. No institution in the world has complete knowledge or all the disciplines that are required. So collaboration is absolutely essential. At the same time, and collaboration is called for by a lot of the funding organizations today as well. At the same time, we all, I think, have this basic need to differentiate ourselves as well and remain ahead of the curve, either individually or as part of consortia. And if you're not competing at an institutional level, you would compete at a consortium level. And of course, the calls for research are also designed as such, because you cannot avoid competition. To some extent, I think we may be able to overcome the negativities of competition if we embrace open science in the manner in which we are talking about it, because you may competitively as a consortium win something, but then you put it out over there for everyone to be able to benefit from and make it accessible as well at the same time. It's a balancing act once again. You do not want everything that you put out in open access to be misused or not appropriately used. So how do you do that? That also, increases the complexity of the research environment that we are today living in and have to respond to. So competition, collaboration, balancing that out, removing some of the negative influences of competition through measures such as open access. I think we just have to, again, take a very conscious approach to this, deliberate upon it, and see how we recognize that we are living in a very interdependent world where every action that we take has an implication well beyond ourselves, and live with that responsibility, to put it very simply.
Yeah. You came back to sort of open science again, and there's another interesting question in the chat about is there a need to build trust in open science? So I guess there's trust in lots of different dimensions within the researchers willing to engage with it, but also from the user's perspective, those willing to sort of engage with it too.
Trust in open science, I mean, to a large extent, I guess, if you're putting your research, your assumptions, your data, your formulations in the open science to be commented on, to be subject to the scrutiny of both experts as well as users, I presume that there should be a higher degree of trust than if we were just putting out results from a black box. How can you enhance trust? I mean, if we are putting out our models and tools for use, then ensuring that we are in some way remaining responsible for, we cannot be fully responsible. That's again something that I would like to emphasize, but in some way remain responsible or be available to be responsible for the use to which our science is put, should be, I do not know, it should be one way of improving trust. But doing so would again put an enormous burden on researchers within IIASA, and we will have to learn from our experiences and see how we can do this efficiently.
Thanks, Leena. There's an interesting question from Andrew. So we've spoken about collaboration between research groups. Collaboration also includes governments and exchanging with, but exchanging with decision makers can be challenging, can be time consuming, as we've discussed. So Andrew asks if there is a formal or informal process for working with or educating governments.
In IIASA?
Yeah, or that you've seen, doesn't have to be IIASA, that you've seen that you think works well.
So apart from government is not one entity, right? I mean, government has its constituents, and decision-making within governments is also influenced by all its constituent elements as well. So, for example, when we were working with regulatory reforms in the country, there were the policymakers, but there were also the regulators that were in place. And in this particular instance, we spent a lot of time, not just in India, but in South Asia, in building capacities of regulatory institutions, but at the same time engaging governments, because there is an interdependent relationship. There has to be independence between policymakers and regulators, but there has to be an appreciation of the roles and responsibilities of each to the other. So capacity building exercises, capacity strengthening exercises are critically important. In IIASA as well, I think we have the very big advantage of having member countries and national member organizations that typically also represent the scientific community in our member countries. And we are able to both learn from them as well as share our experiences in the latest models, methods that we are using in IIASA, the integrations that we are trying to develop, and through these organizations also be able to influence policy. So the influence, or at least getting the ear of decision makers to get them to hear your voice, can be through multiple channels. It can also be through ensuring that we are working very closely with the research organizations in country. And that is definitely an approach that IIASA takes. We are not looking to substitute research capacities in countries, but rather to work with the research capacities and capabilities that exist in country, and together come up with implementable solutions or capacities, and through that process also influence the policymaking community. So again, it has to be a multi-pronged approach. It has to be sensitive to the context in which the research is being proposed. At a global level, the approach would be very different. At a regional level, possibly also different, but at a national and local level, definitely very, very different.
Thanks, Leena. Okay, I'm going to move on to a question about energy transition. So Shana, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, Shana Watts raises the point that transitioning from fossil fuel to electric vehicle means also finding new electricity sources. And is this the kind of issues that IIASA is researching?
So for every mitigation option that we might consider in IIASA, we do look at the technological requirements from a systems perspective. We do look at the infrastructure. We do look at the financial implications. We do look at the broader environmental implications of these kinds of transitions. We are increasingly trying to see how we can reflect the equity dimension of these transitions as well. So the short answer is yes. I think IIASA, both in its modeling approaches as well as in its capacity enhancement initiatives, we have set up a new unit in IIASA called CDAT, Capacity Development and Academic Training. Through this particular unit, we are also trying to see how we can reach out to a much wider community, not just of policymakers, but of scientists and hopefully others who are interested in learning from some of our own experiences in these areas.
Great, thanks. So another dimension has been brought in by Patrick. He also wonders how IIASA, as a global research organization, deals with the data gap between North and South in our research.
That's a very, very big challenge. We are definitely trying to see how IIASA can better integrate citizen science approaches into the research that we undertake. We have set up a new research group that is basically looking at data and new methods by which we can harness the data that is available. I mentioned in passing Earth observations. So there is a lot that can be done at a macro level, even over developing countries, but this has to be corroborated by what is happening and the real situation on the ground. So bringing these two together allows us to do that in a more effective manner. but data gaps remain, and I don't think that we can talk our way through the differences that there are. But as long as we are able to nuance our findings and to be able to put in place the right kinds of caveats to explain how the different quality of data affects the quality of the results and the proposals that or recommendations that we might come up with, I think to some extent we would mitigate this challenge of different qualities of data. But the challenge remains and it has to be addressed.
Thanks, Leena. Thank you so much, Leena, for all these wonderful insights into IIASA research and for bringing your experience to bear on these. We're nearly finished, so we're going to have time for just one last question. And this one's from me. So what do you enjoy most about working at IIASA?
IIASA has given me a fantastic learning opportunity, and that is what I enjoy the most. I worked in TERI for almost 3 decades, over 3 decades, and then I moved on to a university where I was Vice Chancellor for 7 years. A lot of administrative work in my current position. And because of the 10-year strategy that we had in IIASA, of course, there was a lot of work that was on the organizational or administrative side as well. But at the same time, interacting with colleagues in IIASA and the research that they are undertaking, listening to the presentations that they make on their research, and looking at how some of the concepts that I spoke about today of taking more systemic approaches, building in equity, justice dimensions, bringing in governance dimensions, interacting with stakeholders at a wider scale, and seeing it being translated into research and the outcomes and hopefully the influence, I think is extremely rewarding and satisfying.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Leena. And thank you to everybody for joining us here today. A video of this webinar will be available on the IIASA website and the YouTube channel in due course. And we will share all the links that have been mentioned in the talk to you today. I hope you've learned and discovered a bit about setting a research agenda that's both relevant and impactful today. We count on your opinion to improve our future events. So please take a minute to answer our survey that will pop up in your browser after you leave this meeting. And we really hope to see you again at our next IIASA webinar, which is on the 23rd of February, 2022. And please follow us on social media for ongoing updates. Everybody, please have a great rest of your day, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, or night. Good night. Thank you.